first of all, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my context. George Fox University is a Quaker school in Newberg, Oregon. It's, I think, fair to say, an extraordinarily white environment. So we have about a 30% student of color student body, and I think they really experienced like the whiteness of the campus. And so it was something special for us as a university to have programming devoted to Latinx students. So we decided to tailor our program to the community of Woodburn, which is about a 30-minute drive away. It's in rural Oregon. And it's a very agricultural community. A lot of people work in the fields or in construction. And at the Woodburn School District, about 83% of the students identify as Latinx. There's also a kind of bizarre combination of cultures where the other significant population is Russian Old Believers. So you have a very interesting dynamic in Woodburn, but we specified that all liberation scholars would identify as Latinx. So even just a little bit of a word about how the name came about. So the director of the Intercultural Resource Center was talking with me, and I had told him about freedom and citizenship, and he immediately said we should shy away from the language of citizenship. So we started playing around with the language of liberation, and he came up with liberation scholars. I think many people love the benefit of referring to the high school students as scholars. It gets them thinking about themselves in a certain way. And so it took me a little bit of time to come around to that name, but then I just came to love it so much. And our college students who are residential teaching assistants are called liberation mentors. So I'll tell you more about them in a minute. One other thing that was really instrumental was that I had a close friendship with our chief diversity officer on campus, and she's the one who really oriented us towards the Woodburn community. She has family connections there. She lives in the neighboring town. And that is what also Jessica put in the manual, that it's really crucial that you have good relationships with the high school. And so I think having some of those personal connections from Dr. Hernandez was really important to get the buy-in and to get 14 students to come. We did all of our recruiting during the COVID year. So it was quite a feat when they showed up in person. We ran the program for the first time this July, from July 16th to the 30th. Those dates are etched in my memory from all of the planning. It was a 2-week on-campus overnight program, and we were able to have 14 high school students, again, all Latinx, and I believe it was 8 women and 6 men. And most of them, if not all of them, spoke Spanish. But I wanted to just prepare you in some sense for the unexpected. So as we were running our application, I had the Google form and I had the question, what is your first language? And when I was looking at the results, I saw the pie chart, and I think it was 60-some% identified Spanish as the first language. And then there was a major part of the pie that was English, but then there was this little third slice, and I saw that the person identified ASL as her first language. So in addition to having a bilingual program, we had a deaf student with us, and we had interpreters. So it was this, how could I have imagined that would have been one of the languages represented in our group, but also such a good thing for all of us there. So I wonder if I could just share a picture of the students for a moment, just so that you get a sense of the joy of what we were working towards. Let's see, I hope I have the right one. Here's the group picture. Is that what came up? Is it the picture? Yes, okay, good. Just for you to see what it was to bring that group of students to our campus, and really keep the faces in mind as you go through all of the hard and difficult work along the way. Okay, let me just share a few other things about the background. Oh, I think it's very important to be upfront and acknowledge that I myself don't speak Spanish. So I surrounded myself with Spanish speakers. The project manager also identifies as Latino, but his Spanish is not perfect, but all of the college mentors, the liberation mentors, are Latino, Latina, and are fluent in Spanish. And so there was this really beautiful moment at the end of the program at the celebration banquet where the college students themselves affirmed the high school students, and they gave their remarks themselves in English and then in Spanish. And I just wanted to share one other picture with you from that, just to give you a sense of the emotion in the room at that time. So here is a picture of Susie affirming Gladys. Gladys had had some health problems along the way, and you can just see how moving it was. And imagine the parents in the audience or the family members in the audience getting to hear their children affirmed in Spanish in their own language, or the language that they might be most comfortable in. So these are some of the things to keep in mind along the way. Okay, in terms of the program itself, all of the materials and official communication were offered in English and Spanish. So I did hire a translator, and I had, it adds another step in terms of you need more time to provide those documents. But, and if people don't use them, that's fine, but at least it's available to them, and it's part of the culture of the program to have everything available in English and Spanish. I'll speak more about the choice of the texts themselves when we get to the syllabus part, but in a few cases, Spanish would have been the language that the texts were written in initially. And almost everything I was able to find in translation to include in the course reader. So I did that, just kind of using the powers of the internet. It's amazing how many materials are already out there, and we can find, there was a piece, for example, of John Woolman that I wasn't able to find in Spanish, but I hope to get for next year. I will give you just a brief sense now of the overall curriculum. We read 10 texts or excerpts of 10 texts in the 2 weeks, and then this will give you a sense of where Ibn Tufayl is placed in the progression. So let's see, it's a little bit hard I don't see that on my screen in terms of where I can move it around. Let's see, maybe this will help me. So we have Plato's Apology, Aristotle's Politics, and then we went back in time to the book of Exodus from the Hebrew Bible. And then on that fourth day, so the Thursday of the first week, we read Ibn Tufayl from the Middle Ages or the medieval period before going into the early modern texts of Swarwana, and then starting with Hobbes in the second week. So the most important thing in terms of what we'll need to keep in mind for Hayy Ibn Yaqzan is Aristotle's Politics. We did excerpts of book 1, and particularly book 1, chapter 2, with the claim that human beings are political animals. Good. Okay. I think before I turn even more specifically to Ibn Tufayl, I just want to say one or two more things about the bilingual components. So the course reader, I was as explicit as I could be about what was required. So it was required that the students would read the assignments in English, and then the Spanish was optional. I happened to be on campus when the students were reading Ibn Tufayl for the next day, and I was very touched to see two liberation scholars who happened to be twin brothers reading the Spanish version and discussing it with themselves. So I could at least get some sense that the Spanish was really being used. We would very occasionally do a think, pair, share exercise. That's something that I wish I had done more of, but something that just delighted me was overhearing the Spanish doing the pair up part of a think, pair, share in Spanish with each other. So basically what I'm trying to say is that within the classroom itself, there was a lot of freedom to for the students to express themselves in Spanish or to move back and forth between Spanish and English. Good. All right, I think now I can turn to the text itself. I'll try to give you a bare bones sense of the story and even how I came to read it and to love it. So this is a medieval text by a Muslim philosopher. It's from the 12th century from Andalusia. And it's really crucial that it's a philosophical allegory. So while there are these enormous points of philosophy of religion, being made, enormous questions about human nature, about how one experiences God, how one reaches the divine, what one is able to know. All of this is being conveyed through a story. And I think we all love the allegory of the cave in the Republic, but I think we're hard pressed to identify other philosophical allegories. So one of the things that just draws me to this text and keeps me coming back to it is the power of a story to open up thought experiments. So the story itself is very charming. It's about a boy who is raised on an island by a doe. There are no human beings on the island, so he begins life by identifying with other animals, non-human animals. And the mother doe, sadly, she dies, and he conducts an experiment on her to try to revive her. So that's part of the excerpt that was chosen and we'll focus on today. His educational journey, his spiritual journey, it's a Bildungsroman of sorts. He goes through these various stages in 7-year increments. And he's climbing the ladder of knowledge, and he certainly comes to understand a lot about the natural world. He's a natural scientist, but then he continues climbing that ladder and even ascends to religious truths. He reaches the purity laws of Islam completely apart from tradition. So simply by thinking and by imitating nature, he arrives at the purity laws. And then eventually this character, Hayy, is able to experience mystic union with God. And that's, I would say, a major part of the story, almost the first half. Towards the latter bit of the allegory, there's an encounter with society and with other human beings. So at the end, this character named Absol makes his way to the island from a neighboring island that is populated. Absol eventually runs into Hayy, and there's that first moment of encounter with difference. And so that's the second passage that I assigned to the students. I really wanted to focus on that clash or that encounter. We didn't really make use of the end of the story in class, and I can talk more about that, but just so that you know where things end up if you haven't read the story already. Hayy goes with Absol to the neighboring island, and he encounters the ills of society. He discovers what human beings are like, that they are greedy and corrupt, that in many cases they're stupid. Hayy tries to enlighten them and give them the truths that he has reached, and he has mixed success. The foil character to Absol on the other island is called Solomon. Solomon is himself a religious Muslim, but he insists on a literal interpretation of the Quran. And so you can tell that an author like Ibn Tufayl, who himself chooses to write a philosophical allegory, will prefer allegorical interpretations of scripture to literal ones. And so Absol is held up as the admirable believer. Solomon is a little bit of a regrettable concession to human nature, but really the chief figure of all is Hayy. So at the very end of the story, Hayy, in some sense, gives up on civilization, and he returns with Absol to the island of his birth, of his origin, and they live in fair isolation, seeking God together but apart. So that's the rough shape of the story. It's a very readable story. It's a little bit of a mixed text in that the vocabulary is quite demanding and some of the ideas are quite elevated. I mean, we're thinking about the nature of being. And so phrases like supernal ecstasies come up. So in some sense, it's very demanding, but on the other hand, it's incredibly accessible, partly just because it is a story. I really commend this edition to you. So this is Len Goodman's translation. And this is more, I would say, for college students or just for yourselves. There's an extremely extensive set of endnotes here. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Goodman at a conference in Israel, and he's one of the most erudite scholars I've ever come across. And that erudition is completely on display in the very, very extensive footnotes at the back. Which will not be necessary really for the high school students, but are helpful for us in framing some of the material. So now I just want to say a little bit about what it was like teaching the text among high school students. I think you all know how capable they are, and in some case what an advantage it is for them to come to ideas fresh. So there are certainly some limitations to what the students can do or engage, just even in terms of familiarity with the Middle Ages or with Islam. I did very little by way of context, so I gave them pretty minimal background so that we could really focus on ideas and on the passages in front of us, and they did so well. And I'll even sort of reveal to you some of their comments and insights that they arrived at. I would focus on some big picture questions and often even enter into a discussion apart from the text itself, just applying their intuitions, and I'll tell you more about that. But I can just affirm how capable they are and how exciting it is to talk about really big things like what is civilization with students. And now, now there are 14 more high school students in the world who know about a medieval Muslim philosopher and and can build on that when they go to college and study more. Okay, so I guess I can just add a few more framing remarks. I came across this text 9 years ago in teaching contemporary civilization at Columbia. I've been teaching it ever since, and I have been able to advocate for its inclusion in the honors program at George Fox, where it became a favorite in the sophomore year. I've also taught it in a philosophy and literature class where I've had several class periods on it. At Columbia, it's often played off against other medieval philosophers like Aquinas and Maimonides, so it can be part of a much larger conversation of interfaith dialogue, of the tension between faith and reason, about the tension between rationalism and religion and mysticism. I mean, it has so much potential, and it's really no problem for us to spend 2 hours on 5 pages. There's a lot you can do, and then you can scale up from there. Some of the major themes addressed are sociability, reason, experimentation, language, reason apart from language, what can you know, independent from society. Interconnectedness, there's quite a bit on the unity of creation and creatures, in addition to union with God. The theme of experience, religious experience, ecstasy, questions of selfhood, what is the self, what is the soul? And then, as I mentioned before, interpretation. So thinking about different types of interpretation, literal and metaphoric. So in terms of the rhythm of the program, this particular text was taught on a Thursday. So on Wednesday, students received a handout, which I believe was circulated, and I can also share with you again. So they received, I think, a 4-page handout with basic information. They had that for their reading session, and then also sort of in advance of their writing session that they would have had that night. So they read the text for Thursday on Wednesday, and they write about it Wednesday night. And I received those essays by photo on Google Drive before seminar starts Thursday morning. So every handout had basically the same layout or the same set of information. It started with a map. Where are we in the world? So I could have a picture of southern Spain and North Africa. It would also have just maybe 2 paragraphs of background, extremely light background. This is the founding of Islam in the 7th century. This is the Middle Ages period. This is what a philosophical allegory is. Just very basic, we have a character named Hayy. He is dissecting his mother, who is a doe in the first scene, get ready. I would try to include vocabulary in the handout. So I would go through the text in advance and define terms for the students. I'm sure there were other terms that they needed to find, but I at least got them started. You can tell that I kind of ran out of steam because I think I only defined the first 3 pages of vocabulary words and let them finish from there. I also gave the students the writing prompt for that evening. So they had it with them when they even first began the reading. And the writing prompt was so simple. It was, what is Hayy, the character? What is Hayy like? And is he a political animal? There were so many fabulous responses. Some students said yes, some students said no. There were great reasons on either side, and we ended up discussing those in class. And then the last part of the handout is, how do you go further? Let's say you really love this material, what should you do next? And so for each text, I just tried to give a few suggestions. Here, I think I said, you can just read more of the book itself. You can listen to the Quran recited in Arabic. You can read Aquinas and try to find out other medieval perspectives. So just something to stir their curiosity. Not every text will be a favorite text for students, but I wanted to at least encourage them to go on. Good. So just a little bit about Ibn Tufayl himself. I think I said he was a Muslim philosopher. He lives in the 12th century. We're not entirely sure when he was born, but sometime between 1105 and 1110, dying in 1185 and being situated in southern Spain. Like other really famous medieval philosophers, he also had medical training and worked in medicine. Good. I had narrowed the reading down to 5 pages, so it's a very short selection, and I can just be very honest with you and say, I wasn't sure, did I choose the right 2 passages? There were so many things I wanted to discuss and tackle, so I'll give you the reasons I had for choosing what I chose, but who knows, next summer, maybe I would go with something different and see how it plays. So Hayy's journey takes place in increments of 7, and the first 2 are kind of lumped together. And so I tried to choose a passage from around the age of the high school students themselves. And so when Hayy is dissecting his mother, the mother doe, he's maybe between, I don't know, 14 and 21. That part is a little unspecified. But I wanted to highlight experimentation, tool making, and to show that the beginning of his journey is rational, but it is actually transcended at the end. And then, of course, we skip quite a bit of material. And then the second passage was when Absol and Hayy run into each other on the island. And to be very honest, I chose this partly because it's funny. It's a very funny scene of what happens when somebody who's never seen a human being sees a human being, and when somebody from a so-called civilized society sees a human being who looks more animalistic, and what happens. And so we didn't really get to focus so much on that second set of material, but it was there and we had a little bit of time with it. In a way, you can't go wrong. I mean, the whole book is so fabulous. You choose something and you get something out of it. So those were my 2 choices. I think 5 pages was about the right amount in terms of what the students could handle or understand. Okay, so then we had about 2 hours with the text. So the seminar ran from 9:15 to 11:30. It was a very busy day. So part of the culture that I built of our program was one of intellectual friendship and hospitality. So I really made a point of inviting a lot of guests, not just guest lecturers, but guest moderators. So sometimes this was very official and I had to book people way in advance, but sometimes it was spontaneous and I would see somebody on campus. I was running around like a mad woman, you know, completely abuzz for the 2 weeks. And I would just say, come moderate a text with me and let the students get to know you and you can get to know them. So on this particular day, we started with the dignitaries. So we had a visit from our university president and provost. They were with us for about 15 minutes and introduced themselves. But then I asked the Liberation Scholars to tell them what the program was. I wanted them to describe it in their own words and also just say what it meant to them. So part of that was really to show the president and provost who already believed in the program, I wanted them to be touched by the students' stories. And then one thing that I did repeatedly was I asked the same application essay question that was put to the students to all of our visitors. And if I invited them in advance, I gave them the question in advance. So in order to get into the program, the high school students didn't have to have the highest GPAs, but they had to demonstrate intellectual curiosity. And so we sort of tested that or looked for that by asking the high school students, what is one thing that you have a burning desire to know? And how would you begin to find out about that thing? Now, burning desire to know maybe is not the best phrase. I think some of them, they didn't quite know what to make of that, but you can say, what are you curious about? Or you can do it however makes sense. But I had the president and provost tell the students what they had a burning desire to know and how they would begin to find out about it. The provost said that she wants to know what motivates people of their generation. She said she knows what motivates people of her generation, but she doesn't know what motivates them, and that she would go about finding out about that through deep listening. So I learned so much. One person who came to speak to us at the end on the Quaker John Woolman, his burning desire was to know what the kingdom of God is like. Wow, I mean, this is incredible. So I'm learning so much from people about their curiosities and then how they go about. And that professor, he was so cute. He said, sometimes he asks people who he thinks just will have absolutely no idea what the kingdom of God is like, and then they have the most amazing things to say. So I thought, oh yeah, you can ask anybody anything and really learn in surprising ways. So that took up maybe, let's say 15 or 20 minutes. And then I would begin every class by reviewing the timeline. So where are we chronologically and geographically? We didn't exactly move chronologically through the program. So I wanted to be very careful to say, okay, where are we now? There was, I think, a custodian who would come and clean the boards every night, draw the line, but that turned out to be a good thing because it gave us a chance to review the material day by day. So that would have been the very first thing I would have done. I would have said, here's the stretch of the Middle Ages, here's Spain, and kind of in putting the earlier texts on the board, I would have emphasized a few points that were really important from those earlier texts, things to draw attention to. And then I probably just like stepped back and even put the text aside and started with a really healthy amount of open conversation. So I asked the students, what does it mean to be civilized? And I specifically told them, I don't want to hear anything about Hayy. You know, I just want you to think in your own words and terms about civilization. And I want to share with you some of what they said. So one woman said, it's maintaining order. That's what it means to be civilized. Someone else said, it's being with people. It's belonging, it's getting along, it's being able to communicate with others. And then we spent some time thinking about what the opposite is. What does it mean to be, I said, what is the opposite of being civilized? Somebody said, having enemies. Somebody said, being uncivilized. Having your own way of thinking, being selfish, being self-sufficient, being withdrawn, or to be violent. So I let this go on for quite a bit. I really stoked this conversation because it's so fun just to hear what they're thinking and what they can do, almost like Hayy, you know, just on their own, just thinking apart from the text or apart from tradition. And so I had follow-up questions. What are some examples of civilization? Are we more civilized today than in the ancient world? What is a barbarian? So the ideas are very alive to the students. They really are able to do quite a bit with that. And then finally at that point, we turned to the text itself. So we had time to go over one passage before we broke for 5 minutes and then came back. So the first passage that we looked at, and I can try to share my screen, I hope it shows up okay, is a paragraph on being and on the soul. So let me try to pull this up. Okay. Now, part of the problem is that I don't see, okay, here it is. So I have to scroll up. So I'll just read it for you. Hayy turned the focus of his thoughts on that being. So he wants to know what was the animating principle. Once he realized he couldn't bring his mother Joe back to life, he starts to reflect. What was it? What was its manner of existence? What had bound it to this body? Where had it gone and how had it gotten out? What drove it away if it was forced to leave, or if it left of its own free choice? What made it so loathe the body? His mind was filled with these questions. He soon dropped the body and thought no more of it, knowing that the mother who had nursed him and showed him so much kindness could only be that being which had departed. From that and not from this lifeless body, all those actions had issued. The whole body was simply a tool of this being, like the stick with which he fought the animals. His affection was transferred now from the body to that being, to the being that was its master and mover. all his love was directed towards that. So I know that I'm coming close to the end of my time, but I'll just make a few comments on this. You can definitely hear the resonances with Aristotle. So we had a good follow-up on thinking about Aristotelian hierarchies, the difference between the soul and the body, between masters and slaves, between men and women. One young woman said that when she was giving her own reflections on the soul, she said that the reason we have bodies is to make visible the soul. So there are some very deep insights that you can get building off of the earlier text and just even this story of thinking, what was the mother doe after her body had expired? And to share a little bit more personally, we had lost a member of our faculty. It was actually my boss. He died at the age of 34, about a month before the program. And so I really teared up when I was reading this passage because I thought all of the affection transfers from the body to that part that's invisible. So I think I was able to bring some of those, I guess, more personal connections even into the classroom in a way that could stimulate the discussion on something that is so theoretical, the soul versus the body. We had quite a good discussion about whether animals have souls or non-human animals. The students referenced some Disney movie that I had never heard of. So you can see sometimes where their points of reference are. At that point, we took a 5-minute break, and then we came back for another 45 minutes or so to go over, I would say, 1 or 2 more passages. We got to talk about things like clothing and what comes naturally, what are products of society. And then I think the crucial insight from the brief paragraph on Absol and Hayy encountering each other was really focusing on the difference between Hayy's reaction to Absol. Hayy could see that Absol was very nervous about him. And so he like patted him on the head and he tried to comfort him and he showed a lot of compassion to him. Whereas the person from the so-called civilized society had a lot of fear towards what was different. So we were able just to think, okay, on the one hand, we have a story about an individual boy, about his own development, what he's like, but you can also scale that up and think this is really an allegory about human history, human development, and sometimes the clash of cultures and what it's like when 2 different people or bodies come into contact for the first time.